Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So we're going to talk about Sheikh Da'oud Ahmed Faisal and his wife, Mother Khadijah Ahmed Faisal. So Sheikh Da'oud Ahmed Faisal was an Afro-Caribbean Muslim. He migrated to the U.S. in the early 1900s, around 1914, at about the age of 21 years old. And it's unclear. It's very possible. I actually just had the opportunity to speak with a good friend and mentor and teacher of mine, brother named Hajj Dawood Harun, who is an accomplished trombonist as well as an educator and historian in his own right, who served as Sheikh Da'oud Ahmed Faisal's aide-de-camp for a number of years. And one of the things that he shared with me, and he has some writings too on the internet. Maybe we can shoot a link or something out to folks who are on this site so that you can read some of his works. But he intimated to me that Sheikh Dawood's exposure to Islam may have actually come prior to his arrival in the U.S. But in any case, he arrives in the U.S. in the early 1900s, 1914, and he's an activist and he's an artist. He's more so an artist. He actually comes to pursue a career. He's a classically trained violinist, and he comes to pursue a career in that right. But he's involved in all different types of artistic production during the Harlem Renaissance. He writes a play about Samori Touré, the famous West African Muslim revolutionary leader, anti-colonial leader. And this, I believe, he writes in the 1920s. So even in this early period, he's already a part of this cultural scene, this Pan-African cultural scene of which Islam is already a part. And some speculate, like I mentioned before, that he may have met Sheikh Sadi Majid at that time and maybe even become his most visible representative. But it seems as if he's active in the scene of African-American Muslims in the 1920s in Harlem. As evidence suggests that he's actually active in Harlem. But at any rate, he moves to Brooklyn. He lives in a brownstone, and he opens up that brownstone. First, he uses it. He opens up a school of elocution, right? So he's a person who, in addition to being an artist and a spiritual seeker, he's a working man. He has several different occupations, and through that, alhamdulillah, he seems to have been able to amass his own money to be self-sufficient. And one of the things that he does in that regard is he opens up his brownstone as a school of elocution. One of the elders from the community that I interviewed actually said one of his students at one time was the famous black opera singer Marian Anderson. But in any case, another one of the folks who attended that school was a woman who would go on to become his wife, who was a vocalist from Bermuda. Her name is Mother Khadijah Ahmed Faisal, and she's known as Mother as a term of respect in the community. And I think it's important to mention her alongside her husband because both of them went on to make some really invaluable contributions to the community. Mother Khadijah was a teacher of Muslim women, was an inspiration to a lot of Muslim women. We find a lot of the women who were mentored by her went on to help found Muslim women's organizations and do a lot of cultural and religious and political work throughout the community. But by the 1930s, Sheikh Dawood actually opens up his brownstone to use as a musalla, as a place for prayer. And many of the merchant seamen from Yemen, from East Africa, from South Asia, from different places that are working on ships that disembark at the pier that's close by where his brownstone lives, which is on State Street. If you know about New York, Brooklyn, the mosque was located on, and still today is located on 143 State Street. And it's close to this place where the ships would dock. Folks working on the ships, Muslims from different countries, would come off of the ship, leave, go about Brooklyn until it was time for them to get back on the ship. And as the story goes, as my good friend Hajj Dawood Harun shared with me, some of them were walking down walking in Brooklyn, walking down State Street, and they saw an African American man, actually an Afro-Caribbean American man, standing there, and they engaged in salams, and they told him he was looking for a place to pray, and he told them to come pray in his house. And so that began the beginning of his brownstone being used as a musalla, as a place to pray. And by 1939, he actually opened it and incorporated it officially as a masjid. So I'm not sure exactly when he started using it in this capacity, but clearly it was before 1939. And we have indications that as early as the 1920s, he was active as a Sunni Muslim in the Harlem and Brooklyn communities. But he establishes this masjid in 1939. And this masjid still exists, and it's the oldest still existing masjid in New York City, founded by an Afro-Caribbean man, Black American Muslim man. And I use Black American, part of the reason I use Black American is because many of the contributors to this history are also Afro-Caribbean folks, right? So I use Black American to encompass both African American and Afro-Caribbean people who are in this context doing this work. So that's the origins of the mosque on 143 State Street, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. Another person that I want to talk about as an early contributor in this time is a man named Professor Muhammad Izzuddin. Now, Professor Muhammad Izzuddin, he's also very important for this part of the country. But the interesting thing about Professor Muhammad Izzuddin is he has the distinction of being one of the first, perhaps the first, American Muslim religious seeker to actually pursue Islamic knowledge overseas. Right? He actually goes overseas and studies. I had the opportunity to travel to Jordan a couple summers ago, and I was talking with some brothers, and they were talking about, you know, folks who've gone on and studied in Jordan, in Syria and in different places starting in the 1970s, and they would often refer to these folks as like sort of the first generation of people who from America who've gone to study Islamic knowledge, to learn Arabic, to learn Quran, to learn these things. And I had to tell them, no, there's actually a couple of generations of African American, Black American Muslims who've been doing this. So the first that I know of, certainly one of the first in the 20th century, is Professor Muhammad Izzuddin. Now, Professor Muhammad Izzuddin was formerly known as Lomax Bey and also Ali Muhammad Bey. And the reason I share his name before he became Muslim is not to sort of make this sort of an expose when we tell you, you know, people's government names, but rather to pinpoint his trajectory. He was a member of the Moorish Science Temple during the early days of the Moorish Science Temple. We have a famous picture of Noble Drew Ali, I believe in 1926, if I'm not mistaken, taken in Chicago, where you see, it's the famous picture you see of Noble Drew Ali, where he's standing with all of his followers and other leaders in the Moorish Science Temple, and you see one man standing next to him, and this is Lomax Bey. Lomax Bey becomes he emerges as a fixture in the community in Chicago, and is a really capable leader, and he gets sent to Detroit. He gets sent to Detroit to be the leader of the Moorish Science Temple in Detroit. Now, when I went into the archives and I looked at old Moorish Science Temple newspapers, right, what I found is that you had listings of various other cities, right, other than Chicago, that have Moorish Science Temples representatives. And there would be a breakdown of how many members were in the community, how much money was raised, things like this. And consistently, the Detroit Temple, under the leadership of Lomax Bey, was head and shoulders above the rest. So we know that this brother was like sort of the guy in the Moorish Science Temple. Obviously, we don't want to be too quick to make analogies, right? But it reminded me sort of Malcolm X in relationship to Elijah Muhammad, right? Where here you have a person who comes into the movement, is not the founder or leader of the movement, but is a devoted servant to the dawah of that movement, if you will, and who is able to emerge not only as an orator, right, but also as an actual organizer and community builder. So Lomax Bey was that. In 1929, he leaves the Moorish Science Temple over various conflicts, and he ends up going in 1930. He goes to Turkey, right? He goes to Turkey and he tries to get the Turkish government to put some land aside for Black American Muslims who want to come and repatriate. That doesn't work out, and Turkey at the time is in the middle of its own sort of secularization project. But then he travels to Egypt, right? And I actually talked with one of my colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania who's studying the history of Afro-Turkish communities. And I told her about Professor Muhammad Izzuddin, and she went and she actually found some Turkish newspaper articles confirming his visit to Turkey. After Turkey, he goes to Egypt, and we have some documents from Egypt, right, that actually confirm his time in Egypt, and confirm him that he, along with 2 or 3 other Muslims, from around the world were a part of the small cadre that got some training in Azhar and Al-Azhar University in Egypt to go and teach Islam in other parts of the world, right? Very interesting, very fascinating. So that takes place between 1931 and 1936, so roughly 5 years. He comes back in 1936 and he gets right to work. Gets right to work. First, he comes to Philadelphia. Right, it's the first place he comes. So when people who aren't from Philadelphia come to Philadelphia and they see, you know, all these Muslims here, they see how visible Islam is, and sometimes they'll ask me, well, you studied the history of Islam in America, how did Philly get to be so Muslim, right? Did this happen in the last 30 years, 40 years? And I kind of smirk and say, well, actually it goes all the way back to 1938, and it's a long, a long and rich history. But Professor Muhammad Izzuddin comes to Philadelphia. He begins to do work in Philadelphia, and he ultimately he starts an organization called the Adina Allahi Universal Arabic Association, right? The Adina Allahi Universal Arabic Association, and we're going to talk a little bit about his efforts to work with other Muslim leaders in a minute, but he tries to create this umbrella organization that unites and brings together Muslims from around the country, right? And he clearly is active in sort of the Ohio Valley region, and many of the same. So what you find is during this period, you have a number of Muslims during the 1930s, right? Black American Muslims who had been involved with either the Ahmadiyya movement or the Moorish Science Temple, who come over in the 1930s, right? As early as the 1930s, and begin to promote Orthodox Islam, right? And Professor Muhammad Izzuddin is a part of that movement, right? He's one of the people who's teaching and working with Muslims from around the country, right? Including Sheikh Dawood, who we mentioned, including another brother, Hajj Wali Akram, right? Who we're going to talk a little bit about in a minute, and also a brother named Shaykh Nasuruddin Ahmed, right? Shaykh Nasuruddin Ahmed. Shaykh Nasuruddin Ahmed was actually from Pennsylvania, right? Shaykh Nasuruddin Ahmed from Pennsylvania. He actually is the imam or the founder of the International Muslim Brotherhood, right, which is a community that is founded in Philadelphia in the 1940s, right? A young man joins the community, becomes Muslim after the International Muslim Brotherhood, founded by Shaykh Nasuruddin Ahmed, already begins to promote Sunni Islam. A young man named Sheikh Nafi Muhammad, right, who was an artist. Many of these early Muslims were jazz artists, right? So here we find another thread, and I'm pinpointing some things that I'm going to come back to at the end. One is the fact that all these early Muslim leaders were engaged, right? They were engaged in activism and helping to benefit the community. Another thing is that they didn't run away from culture. Many of them were artists. In fact, their exposure to, as mostly jazz artists, but other types of artists, we talked about Sheikh Dawood, who was a classically trained violinist, his wife, Mother Khadijah, who was a vocalist. Their engagement with arts and culture actually helped facilitate their exposure to Islam, right? Because they were global in their thinking, right? They were people who were connected to this emerging black internationalist sentiment among African Americans in urban centers, right? So this was the case with Shaykh Nasuruddin Ahmed as well, and Sheikh Nafi Muhammad. Sheikh Nafi Muhammad comes to the community, distinguished himself as a leader in the community, and Sheikh Nasuruddin Ahmed recommends for him to go overseas and study, right? And so he goes overseas and studies during the 1970s, and he takes his family, right? And two of his sons, Sheikh Anwar Muhammad and Sheikh Anas Muhammad, who are actually the imams of Masjid Quba, right, here in Philly, and who have a school teaching Quran, but also just teaching teaching regular school up into the 8th grade, still functioning, right? So we have a legacy, an institutional legacy that goes all the way back to the 1940s with Sheikh Nasuruddin Ahmed and the International Muslim Brotherhood, which goes on to sort of become what is now the Quba Institute, which is still located in Philadelphia, with Sheikh Anas and with Sheikh Anwar and Sheikh Anas are both teaching. Sheikh Anwar Muhammad and Sheikh Anas Muhammad. I want to make sure I said their names right. I get a little nervous, so forgive me if I repeat myself a bit. But Sheikh Anwar and Sheikh Anas both serve in the community now, teaching people Quran, teaching people Islam, and they're the holders of this legacy that goes all the way back to this time. So we mentioned Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadijah. We mentioned Professor Muhammad Izzuddin. After his time in Philadelphia, he goes on to West Valley, New York, right outside of Buffalo, a small community of Black American Muslims who learn of Professor Muhammad Izzuddin. they decide they want to learn some more about Islam. So they contact Professor Muhammad Izzuddin as a Muslim who has studied, who's traveled, who knows Arabic, who studied Islam at an Islamic institution in the Muslim world for roughly 5 years. And they come and they ask him to come teach them. And so he teaches them and he encourages them to basically buy land and create their own space. So another thing that we see, and another link that maybe we can blast out to the folks after the talk. In addition to the work of Haj Harun, I also want to introduce people that they're not familiar to the work of Imam Talib Abdul Rashid. He's an imam in Harlem, New York, of a community that we're going to talk about in a minute. Another good friend, mentor, teacher, and I say these names because often if we're looking to learn about the history of Islam in America, we'll see some of the more sort of mainstream, accomplished academic authors, right? And often we'll read their books, right? But I found that some of the richest, most insightful accounts of the history of Islam in America actually come from Muslim Americans, right? Black American Muslims who are the holders of this legacy are producing this history, right? So one of the things that Imam Talib, I think, rightly points out is we see many of these early communities, they all embrace a philosophy of self-determination. They're all trying to be self-determined and create self-determined Muslim communities, right? Again, they're coming out of a context of black internationalism, Pan-Africanism, the Garvey movement, right? So in West Valley, New York, these Muslims who are mentored by Professor Muhammad Izzuddin, they buy land, they build homes, they create a community. The community is still there. It's been a lot of wear and tear. It's been through a lot of stuff, but you have the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of these black American Muslims are still there. I was recently up there in West Valley myself and met a few of them. But they established this community, and so we find Buffalo, Philadelphia, this Ohio Valley region, all influenced by Professor Muhammad Izzuddin. Mentioned Shaykh Nasuruddin Ahmed from Pennsylvania, active in Pittsburgh and then in Philadelphia. And then Professor Muhammad Izzuddin and his wife, his wife Karima, right? They ultimately moved to Newark, New Jersey, in I believe it's 1941. Yes, 1941. And one of Professor Muhammad Izzuddin's most sort of visible inheritors, right, who at one time is actually his national representative, is a brother named Sheikh Jabbar, rahimahullah. And Sheikh Jabbar has an interesting distinction, an important distinction, as two sort of distinctions within African American history and Muslim American history rather. One, he's the man who does the janazah for Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz Malcolm X, right? So there's actually a book that he wrote called I Buried Malcolm X, where he gives an account of how he came to be the person who did Malcolm's janazah, the different sort of controversies and whatnot that he had to deal with as a result. Here we have an African American Sunni Muslim who actually studied in Saudi, right? Studied in Saudi, also became fluent Arabic, well learned, comes back, does work in this urban space all throughout New Jersey. Actually, he's active in Elizabeth, but sort of the northern New Jersey area. But his embrace of Sunni Islam does not preclude him from understanding why somebody like Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X's work is important, right? And understanding why the work to actually benefit, particularly the Black American community, is important, right? And this is another sort of theme that we're going to come back to when we wrap up. But the other distinction of Sheikh Hisham Jabbar, rahimahullah, the student of Professor Muhammad Izzuddin, rahimahullah, is that he gives Shahada to Amir Baraka, and actually gives Amir Baraka his Muslim name. The initial version is sort of more Arabicized than Amir Baraka as he becomes a fixture in the Black arts movement and becomes interested in Pan-Africanism and African culture and Black cultural nationalism. He sort of Africanizes it to the Swahili iteration of Imamu Amir Baraka, right? But Sheikh Hisham Jabbar, again, one of the folks in northern New Jersey. He's not the only one, but he's one that is sort of most prominent, right, of folks who are doing this work in northern New Jersey, inspired in part by the work of Professor Muhammad Izzuddin, who actually passed away in 1957. And the last person I'm going to mention of this early period, and then we're going to shift to sort of the last part of the conversation, is Al-Hajj Wali Akram, right? Al-Hajj Wali Akram, founder of the first Cleveland Mosque in Cleveland, Ohio, a part of this sort of network of African American Muslims who are connected to the Ahmadiyya movement, who breaks off in the 1930s to embrace Orthodox Islam. And one of the reasons he breaks off is because him and his community, him and the other African American Muslims who are part of the community, want to learn Islam, right? They want to learn Islam, and they find themselves not having access to Islamic knowledge, right? They find that the people who are sent as representatives of the South Asian-based Ahmadiyya Muslim community have certain sort of limitations, right? They feel they have certain sort of limitations. So they want to learn Arabic. The people who are sent there to teach them Islam can't teach them Arabic. They can teach them Urdu, right? And they say, no, we want to learn Arabic, right? Also, there's sort of racial clashes because they understand the importance of of sort of homegrown indigenous leadership for their religious community, right? Another important lesson that we find, all of these different early pioneers understand that importance, right? And this is something that we're going to come back to again. That another lesson that, you know, hopefully we'll learn if we analyze this history. So, because of all of these different sort of rifts, Hajj Wali Akram becomes one of the first to break off. In the late 1930s, he establishes the first Cleveland Masjid is established. It becomes sort of a Sunni organization in the late 1930s, and he starts something called the Muslim 10-Year Plan, which is his brainchild, which is intended to be a non-profit organization dedicated to helping increase the quality of life for these Black American Muslim people, right? And so again, engaged activism, right, on the part of this Black American Muslim pioneer. And so in 1943, there is a historic gathering here in Philadelphia, and I neglected to mention we're here in Philadelphia right now. Here in Philadelphia, at the local YMCA, you had in 1943 a conference called the Unifying Islamic Societies Conference, right? Uniting Islamic Societies Conference, a gathering that was jointly sort of planned by Professor Muhammad Izzuddin, by Shaykh Nasuruddin Ahmed, who by this time was here in Philadelphia, by Hajj Wali Akram. Sheikh Dawood also attends. So you have this early attempt for Black American Muslims to, in 1943, to come together and create a sort of unified umbrella organization where they're at the very least all in touch with each other and coordinating their efforts to establish Islam and to serve their communities, right? So this happens in 1943. So by that time, this is a conference of Black American Orthodox Muslims or Black American Sunni Muslims, right? And another reason why I use the term Orthodox instead of always using the term Sunni is because you find that the Sunni Shia kind of distinction didn't matter as much to folks on the ground here at that time. This is before the revolution in Iran, before the kinds of there have obviously been contestations between Sunni and Shia Muslims for a long time, but I would argue, and I think a lot of people would agree, that there's a different kind of stigmatization of Shia, that a sort of new iteration of that occurs after the 1979 revolution. So Black American Muslims really aren't getting caught up in that. You know, another historian of